Good afternoon and welcome to Marketing Live for Thursday, July 28th, 2016. I'm your host, Rob Zinkin. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing at Indiana University. Hope you're having a terrific summer, and thanks for being a part of today's broadcast where we pose the question, are your meetings broken? Marketing Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education and beyond. Live broadcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in our industry. All episodes of Marketing Live are free and accessible in the video archives at higheredlive.com and in podcast format on iTunes. Today's live viewing experience is powered by Maestro, the premier marketing tech platform for broadcasters. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. We're about to share a link to M. Stoner's ebook on information architecture, a well-thought-out, well-organized structure for your content will make it easier for visitors to find information and engage with your institution. The ebook includes best practices and examples, so download that now. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Al Pittampalli to Marketing Live. When it comes to thought leadership on having more effective meetings, Al always rises to the top of the list. He is author of the book, Read This Before Our Next Meeting, The Modern Meeting Standard. And we'll also talk about Al's newest book, Persuadable, How Great Leaders Change Their Minds to Change the World, which was released earlier this year. Al started his career as an IT consultant for Ernst & Young, where he advised Fortune 500 organizations all over the country. And now on his own, he helps organizations like NASA, Hewlett-Packard, and Abbott Labs transform their organizational cultures. And he shares excellent content online in the form of blog posts and videos that are just great resources. So Al, welcome. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you for joining.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rob.
Well, great. I'd like to start by going beyond your bio and hearing some more about your story before we get into the topic of meetings. And when you think about your professional journey, is there any specific experience or person or book or any other noteworthy influence that has had a lasting impact on you and your career path?
I would say that Peter Drucker is kind of an intellectual that really kind of profoundly shifted the way I think about my career and just organization in general. I mean, for those of you who don't know who Peter Drucker is, he's kind of like the inventor of modern management. I kind of think of him as almost the Beatles of modern management, because you know how, if you listen to like any current song, whether it be rock and roll or hip hop, if you're a Beatles fan, you can kind of see the Beatles influence. You can say, hey, you know what, I see some Lennon and McCartney in there. Drucker is like that in management. Anything, any kind of management stuff you see inside of organizations, whether it's in books or actually the implementation in organizations, it's kind of got some Drucker influence. So when I was kind of just getting started in my career and kind of developing this hatred of meetings, I heard Peter Drucker, and I read a lot of his stuff talking about meetings as a concession to deficient organizations. And he kind of spoke my language. So he was a real influence on me.
Yes, I think of so many things from The Effective Executive and trying to think of all the Drucker references that you have and things like if the mission were to speak, it would say get back to work and really get after it. So, I want to talk about higher education. And as we were talking about before, many other sectors, I'm sure, with a very meeting-driven culture, but that culture is exacerbated in higher education because we have a culture that is very and can be very consensus-driven. So we often talk about on Marketing Live how, as marketers, we have to influence rather than control in our decentralized environments. And we know for brand strategy work, for example, it's imperative to build internal buy-in, and all of this involves meetings, lots and lots of meetings. And you call meetings the lifeblood of any organization, and that's certainly the case in higher education. They are definitely necessary, but I want to start by asking this: is there any value in using a different term? That is, meetings have such an overall negative connotation, just like strategic planning does, but again, they're the lifeblood of an organization. So I'm just curious if the terminology is something that you've thought about or you've considered.
I actually think a lot about that. I think the language we have around meetings and kind of the semantics is one of the challenges. I mean, when you think about how often we use the term meeting, I mean, today I had a kind of call with a potential client. It was this one-on-one conversation over the phone. We call that a meeting. Last week, I gave a speech at a conference with 1,000 attendees. They called that the annual meeting. I mean, the only thing these two things have in common is that we call them both meetings. And I think that one of the reasons, I mean, it's not just semantics. I mean, there's a real cost to this, which is I think that it obscures the purpose behind these gatherings, right? When you can call everything a meeting, it almost implies that the purpose of the session is to meet instead of the meeting being a vehicle through which we achieve some other purpose. And one of the things that I do with my work is to try to develop a robust vocabulary through which people can talk about meetings so we can cut through the bureaucratic nonsense and get to like, why the hell are we all in the room together?
Yeah, and this question gets at that mindset when it comes to meetings, that you think of everything in that way, as you said, it's a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. So ideally, instead of that negative connotation, and we're going to talk about how we get there, but what should that mindset be towards a meeting? And when it's time for that meeting, what is that immediate thing? I guess another way to ask it is, what should a brand for meetings really be?
Well, I mean, the meeting is not really the important thing here. I mean, the meetings are a tool that are cousins with emails and phone calls and Slack and instant messaging. I mean, for some reason, we've kind of created this meeting and kind of blown it up into something that it's more than it actually is, right? A meeting is a specific way to achieve a particular objective. It happens to be a very expensive way to achieve an objective. It's got incredible benefits, but it's also got extraordinary costs. So I think, there's lots of things we can do to try to kind of euphemize meetings and to think about how we talk about them so that way people develop a distaste or less of a distaste for them. But I think more importantly, what we need to do is look behind the covers and find out, why is it that so many meetings are ineffective? Why is it that what lends itself or these sessions to just kind of utter chaos and this diffusion of responsibility that happens inside a meeting where we don't seem to get from point A to point B?
Mm-hmm. And before we talk about some of those specifics or mechanics of meetings, I do want to follow up on the culture point and the culture that surrounds meetings, because we simply have too many meetings. So why is that? I mean, why do we have too many meetings? Is it a matter of we're not sure what to do, so we call a meeting to talk about it? So why do we have too many? And then where do we even begin? What do we do about it?
I mean, there's a lot of reasons. It's almost, there's a confluence of many factors, and we can't go over all of them. But one of them is clearly that meetings are convenient. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, if we want to send out a memo to our staff of 10, writing is hard, right? It will take a lot of time to kind of cogently create a memo, but human beings, even the least educated, are good talkers, right? We're just naturally, innately good at language, at least verbally. So we can just get into a room together with 10 people and just talk say our piece, and boom, we kind of achieve our objective at an incredible cost. I would argue, but still, we did at least achieve the objective. But I think one of the things that you had pointed out, which I think is one of the major factors that lead to this kind of culture of over-meeting, is this idea that meetings are a concession to decision-making anxiety, right? I mean, as human beings, when we face anxiety, which everybody who's ever made an important decision does, the kind of instinctual response is to gather around people. I mean, think about funerals are a kind of a morbid example of this, where, at a time of grief, at a time of pain, we feel the need to get a lot of people around us. Meetings are like that in organizations. It's decisions are scary. Decisions are hard. Issues that mean the life or the the death of an organization or the success or failure of any particular project is really scary. So it's helpful to get people in a room together to kind of diffuse the responsibility and to kind of commiserate behind, wow, this is a really hard thing. Like, what do we do? The problem is that strategy often leads to more confusion rather than more clarity.
And I want to follow up on your point, Al, about the convenience, because I completely agree that one of the reasons that we have too many meetings is that it is way too easy to call a meeting, to convene a meeting. So any suggestions on ways that might create some sort of a process to make people pause and contemplate and think, is this meeting actually even worth it, or is it necessary? Some sort of meeting capital that might make you more thoughtful about, do I want to expend my meeting capital right now? Do I want to use this so there's some value, or it's seen as valuable, rather than just, as you said, I can just go on somebody's calendar and look and see if they're available, and boom, we've scheduled a meeting.
Yeah. I mean, I've often thought of, done these thought experiments where I thought to myself, if in order to call a meeting in an organization, I mean, it's a pretty immense power, right? Like in any organization, if, they have these very tight budgets for people, where if you're given a corporate credit card, it's almost like over a certain amount, it's usually not very high, you kind of have to get approval, and there's high scrutiny over like a $50 purchase. And yet with a click of a button in any organization in America, in Outlook, you can schedule a meeting of like 10 people without any approval. And, if you add up the salaries of those individuals, we're talking about, extraordinary costs financially. So it is pretty extraordinary that we're given this immense power to, I call meetings a weapon of mass interruption because of how costly they can be. Now, is the answer to kind of create some kind of meeting tax where there is some type of approval process, or there's some way of kind of adding friction to that process? I don't know. Some organizations have experimented with that, and my gut is that that's not the right direction to go. I think the real way to do it is this kind of self-policing, which is the same process that we go through when we make any significant purchase, or when we ever invest any amount of time and effort that is going to lead to kind of expensive consequences. We pause for a second, we reflect. The best thing we can do is get somebody else's advice, right? Because they're an objective party that might not be subjective to the same biases that we have. And that's why I always recommend kind of like this designated driver approach, where especially when it comes to these big heavyweight meetings where you're talking about a lot of people in a room together, talk to somebody else about it first, really conversate with them and say, hey, I want your feedback. I'm thinking about calling a meeting of this many people. Here's what the goal is. And they'll tell you, if you give them the permission to give you feedback, you'll be amazed at how something that sounded so good in your mind a minute ago now seems like a terribly wasteful idea just because you had the feedback from somebody else. So I think that that's the kind of thing that responsible leaders, need to do more often to make sure that they're holding the right kinds of meetings.
So you've talked through that perspective, if you're the leader calling the meeting, but I want to flip to the other side. So if I send that Outlook meeting request to you, Al, and it shows up on your calendar, and so I'm sure many people can relate to that, and they get that meeting request. So what's the next step on that end? What should the person be thinking or asking, or what criteria should they be thinking about? Am I necessary to be at this meeting? Should I go to this meeting? How do you approach it on that end? And maybe you feel like you shouldn't go to the meeting.
I'm amazed. I continue to be amazed, but not surprised at how often people are willing to allow other people, whether their boss or their peers, hijack their own personal agendas. It really is. I mean, the idea that you would go to a meeting without knowing why you're going or what the value it is to the organization or you, to me, is confounding. Now, trust me, I understand, because I was in the corporate world for a while, and there's a pull for conformity. But I think that it's something that everybody needs to really reflect on and realize that you only have so much time in your role in your organization, and you have things you need to do yourself. So maybe it might be the path of least resistance to just go to that meeting. But think about, you got objectives, you got work to be done. And if that doesn't get done, at the end of the day, you're going to be hurting yourself. So I think when you first start with that attitude, then the second question becomes, okay, how do I do this without getting fired, right? How do I approach my boss in a tactful, in a diplomatic way? And there are tactics for doing that, right? Like, one of them is to play dumb. The one thing that I tell people, instead of being the aggressive person, I often get accused of being a little bit of a provocateur, but instead of being the person who's kind of starting fires, be the person that's just ignorant. Your boss sends you a meeting invitation and you say, hey, I just wanted to, you send them an email back, you go approach me and you say, hey, I just wanted to be really well prepared for this meeting. Can you let me know? Because I wasn't really clear on, like, so what's the goal of it? Like, what are some of the objectives? Like, what are some of the reasons why you think that I'd be useful at this meeting? And what you're doing is you're kind of forcing that person, your boss, your colleague, to kind of think through, why the hell are we getting in a room together? And I think that process, that exchange that happens in a meaningful conversation is so critical. And it's probably the key to getting to the million-dollar question, which is, why are we having this meeting to begin with? And that's often your way out.
So then let's assume that the why is addressed and there's a great reason to come together as a team. So I want to get to the actual meeting. And again, as you articulate, we all want meetings that are productive and energizing and purposeful. So where do we start there? It almost seems like that can be overwhelming because there are a variety of considerations. So let's stop with thinking about those preparation pieces. And if I'm running a meeting, what are the things that I need to address ahead of time, and the decisions that I need to make ahead of time going into a meeting to do the proper preparation to ensure it will be productive, it will be energizing, it will be purposeful?
Are you talking about a meeting leader or as an attendee, or both?
As a meeting leader. Leader.
There's lots of considerations, and I think that there, some are more important than others, especially depending on the kinds of meetings. But one of the most fundamental questions you can ask yourself as a meeting leader that will set the stage for how you operate the meeting is this meeting designed to speed things up, or are we trying to slow things down? So here's what I mean by that. So when it comes to decisions in organizations, where most meetings, when you drill down to it, revolve around some kind of decisions that need to be made or communicated. There's some kind of issue at stake that needs to be resolved, essentially. So the question you need to ask yourself is this the kind of decision that is a little bit more of a low stakes decision, where the goal should be to try to resolve this as quickly as possible so we can get back to the matter at hand and kind of move things forward? Because the way you operate a meeting with a low stakes decision, where you really want to try to get past an issue as quickly as possible, because a good enough decision is good enough, is very different than the kind of big high stakes issues that we have in organizations that really mean a great deal, right? Like, we can't just have a good enough decision. We need a great decision. We need to really do our due diligence. That kind of meeting is going to operate a lot differently, because your goal is not to speed up, it's to try to slow down. Everything we know about effective decision making from the academic literature, as well as just kind of the experience of successful decision making leaders, is that the key to making good decisions is robust debate. It's about what the decision-making literature calls moderate task conflict, which is an exchange of ideas, criticism, judgment. This is the kind of thing that, as a leader, you should foster in a meeting that is designed to slow down and to debate very hefty issues. But it's the exact opposite approach for issues that are smaller, that are small fish, that you just need to go through as quickly as possible, get consensus as quickly as possible, try to get as minimal buy-in as you can, and then say, okay, guys, now we need to get back to work. Our ability to run meetings effectively is completely dependent on our ability to prioritize those two types of things. When is an issue in an organization important enough that it warrants kind of a more heavyweight debate-oriented meeting? And when is it kind of small fry, that the goal should just be to speed things up, to get buy-in, to communicate a decision, and then move on.
And it's an important distinction there, and I want to ask further about the smaller issues. One of the things that I remember from your book, one of my favorite comments was from Read This Before Our Next Meeting. You said that meetings should be less like, I think it was the endless commercials during a football game and more like pit stops at the Daytona 500. And I love that mentality of a fast-paced, focused approach to meetings where, again, you know things are going to happen quickly and they're going to get done, as opposed to just sort of the meandering and wandering and boredom that sometimes ensues. So any specific tips on trying to get to that level and get to that sort of culture that you have for meetings, that they are productive, they are fast-paced, and how should you as a leader approach meetings to be able to have those sorts of outcomes?
Well, one of the things that's so critical in organizational culture is trust, right? I mean, we need to have this implicit agreement. It actually needs to be made explicit, which is that in an organization, if everybody gets consulted on every single decision, we will never make any progress. There will be no speed, there will be no innovation, there will be no agility. So this this social contract has to be reached where we say that, listen, if I'm a leader, for big decisions, right, for decisions of import in an organization, stuff that is sensitive, that is controversial, that affects my team in a very profound way, I promise you, my agreement with you is that I'm going to consult you. I'm going to get your feedback. I'm going to kind of get your buy-in because I want to make sure I'm making the right decisions. When it comes to smaller issues, the kind that you had just pointed out, the agreement needs to be different. The agreement needs to be, listen, in order to reserve time for those bigger issues, I need your permission to be able to make some decisions quickly. I need your decision to make some decisions, even if you don't love it, even if in the moment you have some judgment. If we're in a meeting and I voice that, listen, this is kind of a smaller decision versus a bigger decision, you have to be willing to play with me, you know? And it's often that conversation that doesn't happen in advance that has these 20-minute meetings turn into 2-hour meetings because you don't have those expectations. And so now one person disagrees or is a little upset, so you feel the need to spend an hour trying to get buy-in, wherein the teams that have sufficient trust are able to deal with that conflict in a much more kind of agile way.
And just a quick reminder for viewers, if you have a question, if you have a comment, please tweet using the HireItLive hashtag. I'd love to hear from others about their struggles and experiences when it comes to meetings at their college or university. And I want to ask you, Al, about informational meetings and if they serve a purpose or not. And in my case, the example that comes to mind is I hold a meeting of unit leaders once a month, and we get together to discuss items and issues that cut across all of our areas. And this team is housed on 2 different campuses, so I see value in having that rare time where we are all around the same table. So this would be more of an informational meeting. I would consider it an informational meeting. So do you have any specific recommendations on those informational meetings, and should we even be having those?
Well, so I have a lot of principles that I kind of outline in my book and my work, but the rule of thumb is, regardless of all those principles, if a meeting is working, then it's working. You know, the kind of throw the principles out of the rule, because if it works for you and your organization, then it's probably adding value. But the caveat is, what you think might be working, your people don't necessarily think is working, and what you think is a successful meeting, people think is disastrous. So you have to the feedback channels have to be open. You have to be willing to kind of ask people what they really think and that kind of thing. That being said, when it comes to informational meetings, one of the things that kind of influenced, or one of the organizations that influenced my thought in informational meetings is in the educational world, but the Sal Khan and his Khan Academy. So I'm sure you guys are most of your audience is familiar with Khan Academy, but his story really quickly, Sal Khan was a hedge fund guy who didn't like being in a hedge fund, but he really liked tutoring his cousins in algebra. And so the problem was his cousins were halfway across the world. So he started recording his himself in videos teaching algebra and then uploading them to YouTube on the web. And so what he predicted happened, which is his cousins started using the videos on their own time in a different time zone. They loved it. What he never would have imagined is that the videos would spread, that millions of people all over the world would start to stumble across these videos and start teaching themselves everything from algebra now to science to world history. It was almost like this revolution was occurring. And Sal Khan saw this, and he asked himself, well, what is going on? If people are learning at home on the web, then what is the classroom for? And this was like a profound kind of crisis he had. And he came to this realization, which is that we should flip the classroom. We should, the lesson, the script, we should actually do at home, and we should do the homework in class. See, what Sal Khan realized is that the scarce time, the important time, is the time you have in the group, right? That when the teacher is live or there, that's where you should be discussing the interesting stuff, the complex stuff, the fun stuff, right? Get the boring kind of stuff, everything you can out of the way before you actually show up to the classroom. The reason why I tell you this story is because I think that same kind of thinking needs to happen when it comes to organizations and meetings, right? We have this scarce time, very expensive synchronized time that we have in a room with our staff. So the question is, what do we want to get out of the room? What do we want to get out of the way so we can maximize the time with the team? So you may have like 60 minutes of stuff that you want to communicate to your team in this informational meeting, but maybe only 30 minutes of it, maybe only 20 minutes of it is actually the kind of stuff that's really important, that's controversial, that's fun, that's exciting, that is complex enough that you really want to have a dialogue. Get the 30 or 40 minutes of communication out of the way. Send a memo in advance. Hell, do what we're doing, record yourself on camera, send it to them in advance, let them consume that, and then you have a much more productive and engaging and much shorter session that people walk away from energized, feeling like they maximize that live time.
It's interesting to think about the being on the recipient side again. And you talk about that the modern meeting rejects the unprepared. So I think sometimes we think of as a meeting attendee, not necessarily leading a meeting, but attendee, that our job is maybe to show up and it's a passive role. So how do you sort of shift that where the onus is on those who are in attendance, and they know that the expectation in this meeting is that it's going to be very participatory and they have a clear role. And I guess to elaborate on that, I think a lot of people would talk about, common meeting practices, you need to send out an agenda in advance and have clear action items and takeaways. But I want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of that point about rejecting the underprepared and what the obligation is as a leader running the meeting, and then really what the onus on the meeting attendee should be to ensure that these objectives that we have in our meetings are accomplished.
Well, one of the things you said, which I think is actually kind of an interesting thing that I think is often neglected, is that, communicating the role to the attendee, right? Like really one of the important things in order to make sure that meeting attendees are prepared is to actually communicate to them why they're at the meeting. I mean, it's amazing how I work with leaders all the time, often senior leaders, and they have, these staffs of maybe 8 people, at least the ones that kind of report directly to them. And every meeting, all 8 people are there. All 8 people he invites to virtually every single one of these meetings. And what he's basically training them to think is that, I'm basically dispensable. I'm just like everyone else. This is just a formality. I'm coming. I have no real unique contribution. And that is a real mistake for 2 reasons. One is because it's a demoralizing way to think about yourself. Secondly, the decision-making research shows that when people are primed to know what their unique contribution to the meeting is, they actually contribute unique information to the meeting, and that actually leads to better decision-making. So the point is, you need to sell people a little bit, right? Like imagine for a second, I know that the kind of the culture of organizations, which I think is terrible, it's an abomination, is that when you send an invite to a meeting, if it's your boss, people have to attend, right? It's not optional, right? It's not like, oh, if I don't like the meeting, I won't attend. No, it's essentially the culture is that it's kind of this, it's almost like receiving a subpoena to attend a court, right? Like if you don't come, you're going to go to jail. But if you're a meeting leader, pretend for a second that wasn't true. Pretend that every person was empowered to opt out of your meeting if they wanted to. How would you sell them, right? You would probably do two things. You would say, one, here's the benefits of the meeting. Here's why we're actually having the meeting. Here's the benefits to me, to the organization. But two, here's why you're such a valuable part of this meeting. Here's why only you and only you need to be here, because you have a particular contribution that other people don't have, right? Maybe it's because they have a particular unique skill set. Maybe they have an engineering mindset. Maybe they're just really good at brainstorming. Maybe it's that they are extra critical and you want them to play kind of the role of the devil's advocate. Whatever it is, if you can kind of give people a unique understanding of why you pick them, I guarantee you their willingness to come prepared and to do homework will go up by an order of magnitude.
I love that. Great advice. Something for us all to think about when we schedule those meetings or plan those meetings. But I know we have listeners and viewers who are in that boat where they feel like the meetings are just draining and not a worthwhile use of their time. They'd rather be doing real work. So you talked about the opportunity to reach out in advance and ask about what's going to happen and the purpose of the meeting. But I'm interested in any other everyday leadership opportunities for attendees. What do you do? How do you approach that? How do you sort of, you're not running the meeting, but again, an everyday leadership opportunity where you can step forward and try to shift things in a way that makes this a more valuable use of your time and everyone's time.
Yeah, I mean, I think questions are a really good way to do this. I mean, I think that really questions are great because what a question does is it guides focus, right? If I ask you a question, what does an elephant look like? What I just do, I just completely guided your attention into a different thing. Now you're actually thinking about what an elephant looks like. Yeah. So if we can, the most valuable contribution attendees can make is to ask questions that guide the meeting towards its destination, right? So what will always happen in a meeting is you'll start with point A, and then hopefully you will try to meander towards point B, which is the destination, the objective of the meeting. But along the way, it will always get derailed, right? That's just almost the human condition, that we get distracted, we start to focus on things that aren't as important. And so asking questions like, okay, so what exactly are we trying to accomplish here? Or can you tell me what if somebody started to raise an issue, can you tell me what that issue contributes to the conversation? Or, how do we make sure that we address this issue that's on the agenda here that isn't currently being addressed? These things are crucial for attendees to do, because sometimes the meeting leaders are so busy leading the meeting, they don't have the kind of cognitive bandwidth to make sure that some of these things get addressed and the meeting kind of gets in the right direction.
Yeah. I also want to circle back to your comments as you made that distinction between an organization's really heavy items that need substantive debate versus some of the smaller items that you can churn through more quickly, and go back to the point about decisions. And you've said that meetings don't make decisions, that leaders make decisions. So when we think about the decision-making processes, what role should meetings play? I mean, should we primarily think of meetings, that is, as a way to support a decision that's already been made, as a way to have some of that debate on the front end before a decision is made? How should we, in large part, think about the decision-making process in conjunction with meetings?
Well, the first thing you do is you think about the decision-making process completely divorced from the meeting, right? Don't even think about the meeting. And this is a very useful time to stop and just actually acknowledge what a decision-making process is, because it's one of those vague, ambiguous terms that we hear so much that our kind of brain just shuts off when we think about that. It's one of the most important things that leaders can really understand. A decision-making process is just a series of steps that gets you from the problem that you're trying to solve to the actual resolution, to the decision that when it actually gets made. Just those steps. And they don't have to be complicated, right? So for any decision that I need to make, let's say it's buying a car, a decision-making process could be 2 steps, right? Like step 1, I reach out to a bunch of friends to find out what their thoughts are and what the best cars are. 2, I sit in my room, think about that information, and I make a decision myself. That is a completely valid, common, and useful decision-making process. And a meeting wasn't even a part of that, right? So we need to prove to ourselves that we don't need a meeting necessarily to make a decision. Now, in organizations, on the other hand, it turns out that meetings often are a really good way to make decisions and to open up ideas. But you need to start with the decision-making process first before you start thinking about the meeting. So, what is the process? What kind of decision is this? What are the steps that I need to take? Do I first want to, usually a decision-making process starts out with generating ideas, right? We want to open up the floor to make a lot of different options. Then you probably want what we call convergence, where we start to whittle away some of those options so we start to arrive at the best option. And then the third step to a decision-making process is often kind of the resolution, where we actually make the decision. Where does the meeting fit into those, right? Maybe you want a meeting for the first part. So maybe you want a brainstorming session to make sure that lots of people are heard and then you get a lot of ideas. Maybe the meeting happens for the second part, where you yourself and maybe with a colleague start to actually develop all the ideas. And then in the second phase, you need people's help to actually start to whittle away the decisions. The point is, there's a million ways to use the meeting, but it's the last step, deciding where the meeting is. You start with the decision-making process and then figure out where in the process to actually use the meeting.
Yeah. And another thing that comes to mind in thinking through that is again, I mentioned earlier in higher ed, a brand strategy process where we need to get a lot of buy-in throughout the university and get our colleagues to understand and value and be a part of what's happening. And some of those discussions may take the form of a meeting. But at the same time, when you get a lot of people together, you can have a situation where a bold idea, those corners sort of get rounded off, the idea gets watered down a little bit. And I'm sure there are colleagues who are trying to strike that appropriate balance between using the meeting as a vehicle to bring people together and understand and be a part of that process, but at the same time not have the consequence of that being, well, we have an idea that's essentially watered down, and we're not taking the sort of the bold step forward that we were originally intending or hoping to do.
Yeah, and that's why I think that almost and there's probably some exceptions to this, but for pretty much all decisions in organizations, the way leaders should think about it is the final step in the process is the leader decides, right? The leader has to be the final part of the process, right? Because listen, consensus is an amazing thing. We should all strive for consensus in an organization, but consensus is devilishly elusive sometimes, right? I mean, how many times have we tried to achieve consensus and it just doesn't happen the way you want it to? That's why the leader needs to always be what I call the decision owner, the person who at the end of the day is accountable for the quality and the speed of a decision. Now, a decision owner isn't necessarily a decision maker. As a decision owner, you can say to yourself, you know what, I want the group to decide this. Let's go, let's get it, let's look for consensus. But if the group can't make the decision the way you thought they would, well, then the decision owner has to then insert himself to the process and then become the tiebreaker, and then ultimately make sure the decision is made. The same thing that happens when it comes to innovation, right? I mean, when there's so many, like you just pointed out, so many times where, you go through the consensus process, you get your committee together, and the decision that kind of emerges is just this terrible kind of bland committee-esque bureaucratic thing. And the decision-making leader has to be able to stand up and say, you know what, this didn't work. I'm going to have to come, get together with Bob and Mary and we're going to have to figure out whether there's a better way to do this. That sounds almost kind of scandalous in an organization, because it feels like, whoa, this leader's a dictator. He's not being part of the team. This is the essence of leadership. The essence of leadership is constantly moving back and forth between the decisive leader who knows that we're short on time, we need to make a decision, and we need to go in this direction, even though a lot of people think we need to move this direction, to the persuadable leader over here, where we need to gather opinions, have a healthy amount of self-doubt and humility, and be willing to defer to consensus and kind of the collective opinion of the group.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, Al, to transition to your new book, newest book, Persuadable. And I would say higher education certainly is among the many industries that is experiencing unprecedented change. And in that book, you make the point that because we're all facing some degree of uncertainty, and because change is happening more rapidly than ever, that it's actually being persuadable as a leader that is undervalued, but instead we're often more concerned with being persuasive, and that's what we typically think of as leadership. And not that being persuasive is not important, but that being persuadable can be a competitive leadership advantage. So how did you get there? How did you arrive at that conclusion?
Well, it was along the train of thought that I was just on, which is this idea that I spent the last kind of 5 years, or at least after the first book came out, writing the book and talking about decisive leadership. This idea that in organizations, we just so often are just over talking almost trivial decisions to death, where because leaders don't want to just hurt some feelings sometimes and make a decision and move on, right? That often happens inside of polite organizations. But at the same time, what I really realize is that for the big decisions, the ones that actually are of import, that really mean a lot to the organization, we need to do the opposite. Being decisive is not the right way to do it. We need to actually be persuadable, willingness to change our minds in the face of evidence, being willing to get lots of different opinions from different people. This is a critical part of being a leader. And I think that it's almost, sometimes we're too decisive, or sometimes we're too persuadable. We got to be willing to do both. And I think that the one thing that I think some of the most successful leaders have a problem with is being persuadable, because it feels like a weakness. But in a world that's changing faster than ever, I actually think it's the ultimate leadership advantage.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That it certainly goes against what people may think of when it comes to a strong leader, and that traditional leadership approach of being strong and confident and consistent. So I want to dive into that a little bit more and see if you could share an example or two from the book or elsewhere where the persuadable leadership approach has proven to be especially effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I start out the book by talking about Admiral McRaven, who's the arguably the most successful commander in military commander in recent history. He's the guy who most famously oversaw the raid to get Osama bin Laden. And when we think about military leaders, if I were to just kind of like snap my fingers and ask you to give me some characteristics of what you think successful military leaders should be or are like, you'd probably come up with words like confident, convicted, consistent, because these are the kinds of things that culturally we associate with successful leadership. But Admiral William McRaven, what was so shocking when I first read the account of him, wasn't like that at all. I mean, in many ways, McRaven was inconsistent, right? He was constantly changing his mind. He was unusually open to suggestion, and he seemed to go out of his way to make sure he wasn't overconfident. He would constantly kind of hedge and doubt himself. That doesn't mean that he wasn't physically a very kind of imposing person, but he had this intellectual habit of making sure that he was opening his mind to suggestions and being willing to kind of engage with contradictory evidence. And I thought that was so shocking and so surprising, almost like he was an outlier. But then I realized that there's a reason why he's that way. It's because he's the leader of special operations. And special operations are unconventional. They're full of surprises. They are, by definition, special, right? The world in special operations is constantly changing. The enemy is constantly adapting to every move you make. A decisive leader, somebody who's a stay the course kind of person, who's so confident that they have the right plan, fails in those kinds of environments because as soon as they think they have the right answer, the world changes and they no longer have the right answer. So McRaven was such a great example of how a persuadable leader in the military is so important right now, because the military is changing faster than ever. But think about every industry. Think about the world you're in. Think about the world that I'm in. I know that my world is changing faster than ever, right? I mean, with globalization, with the increase in technology, with just the rapid pace and kind of the way organizations have to shift to market demands and stuff like that, we're all in special operations, meaning that we all need to tend towards being persuadable, being willing to change our mind with changing circumstances.
Well, that's something that I appreciate about your work, Al, is that you push us to think a little bit differently, whether it's this in terms of being persuadable as a leader, or even going back to meetings that we think of as this everyday, we have 5, 6, 7, 8 a day, but something that should be something sacred and special, and play a really special role in the life of an organization. And as we wrap up, I want to circle back and close on meetings. And you've been at this for a while and have studied meetings and have written about it, experienced it, consulted. And I'm interested if your viewpoint has shifted at all along the way, or there have been any new revelations or things that you've learned since you first wrote the Modern Meeting Standard, sort of how your perspective on meetings has evolved, if it has at all.
It has evolved, and that's why I actually wrote, there's a second edition of my book that just came out last year in September, where I was luckily given the opportunity. They re-released it because they wanted to, the publisher wanted to get it to a new audience, and I was lucky enough to kind of be able to amend the Modern Meeting Standard. So I encourage anybody who's read the first edition of the book, read the second book, because you'll find that there's a lot of, there's significant differences in there. And I admit it, like that's what's so funny about, you see this in politics. People can't admit to changing their mind, or they're perceived as a flip-flopper. I'm happy to be called a flip-flopper because I think that's part of being an intelligent human being. But rather than articulate kind of all the differences, which I think the book does better justice in doing that, I think I'd use this as an opportunity to just encourage people to realize that the world is changing, and we do need to be able to change our minds with changing circumstances. And a decision you made today shouldn't necessarily be a decision you're going to make tomorrow. Just because you chose a certain path last week doesn't mean you can't turn course, because that's the responsibility of successful leaders, is to make sure that they're not just going in the direction that makes them look good, they're going in a direction that serves their organizations, their communities, their team, and just society in general.
Well, Al, I can't thank you enough for all the terrific advice and lessons that we can all benefit from. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. I've really enjoyed it.
It's my pleasure, Robert.
Well, for viewers and listeners who want more of this content, where should they go to connect with you and benefit more from your work?
You can go to modernmeetingstandard.com. If you just search Modern Meeting in Google, it'll come up. But yeah, that's my blog. You can see a lot of the content I've put together. I've also dedicated a section to how to run an effective meeting. You could probably spend an hour there and really develop some better meeting habits.
Great. Well, thanks again to Al Pittampalli, and thanks as always to M. Stoner for making Marketing Live possible. Be sure to get reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. I'm Rob Zinkin. Thanks again for tuning in to Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network.